Sometimes it was found in helping others while still healing yourself. The crowd applauded. Evelyn looked toward Graham. He simply nodded. He knew she understood. Later that afternoon, Brock approached her near the edge of the training area. He kept a respectful distance. "I wanted to say thank you." Evelyn looked surprised. "For what?" "For showing me something I should have learned years ago." She waited. That strength doesn't need an audience. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn nodded. "I'm glad you learned it. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it was something important. Respect." Months continued passing. Brock kept volunteering. He helped young athletes understand that confidence did not come from making others feel small. He worked with beginners who reminded him of his younger self. Every time he saw fear in someone's eyes, he remembered the fear he had caused and chose a different response. The road was not easy. Some people never fully trusted him again. Some doors stayed closed. But Brock learned that true accountability meant accepting that reality without becoming bitter. He could not change the past. He could only change what he did next. Evelyn eventually became a mentor at both the library and the academy. She created programs for people rebuilding confidence after difficult experiences. Her greatest gift was not her ability to teach techniques. It was her ability to make people believe they mattered. And Graham Holloway continued doing what he had always done. Helping people discover the strength they already carried inside themselves. Years later, visitors entering Iron Crest Academy often heard the same story. Not the story of a famous black belt. Not the story of a retired Navy SEAL. Not even the story of a frightening day when everything almost went wrong. They heard the story of how an entire community learned that strength without compassion was empty, and compassion without courage was incomplete. They learned that people could fail terribly and still choose to become better. They learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let pain control the future. Before we end this journey, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe people can truly change when they accept responsibility for their actions? What lesson from this story stayed with you the most? Your words may inspire someone else who is searching for hope today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes the greatest victories are not the moments when we defeat someone else. Sometimes the greatest victories are the moments when we finally defeat the worst parts of ourselves. And on that bright afternoon in Ashford, a community that once watched someone misuse strength learned a lesson it would never forget. True power was never about making others afraid. True power was about making others feel safe. The seasons changed slowly in Ashford, but the lessons learned inside Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy continued shaping lives long after the original incident faded from public conversation. The building that had once carried an atmosphere of pressure and fear became a place where people came not only to train their bodies but to strengthen their character. The trophies that once dominated the walls were no longer the first thing visitors noticed. Instead, photographs of community projects, volunteer events, and students helping one another filled the spaces where championship victories had once been displayed. For Coach Raymond Ellis, the transformation remained a daily reminder that leadership was not about appearing perfect. It was about accepting responsibility when things went wrong and having the courage to rebuild. He often arrived early in the morning, before classes began, and stood quietly in the empty training hall. The sunlight would spread across the mats where everything had changed. Sometimes he remembered the fear that filled the room during the exhibition. Sometimes he remembered the silence that followed because people were afraid to admit what they had allowed to happen. But he no longer looked at those memories with shame alone. He looked at them as reminders. Reminders that every person had a responsibility to speak when something was wrong. Reminders that protecting a community required more than rules written on paper. It required people willing to live by those rules. One afternoon, Ellis received a letter from a former student named Oliver Bennett. Oliver had left the academy 2 years earlier after losing confidence during his training. At the time, he believed martial arts was only for naturally gifted athletes. He believed he would never belong among stronger competitors. The letter explained that after hearing about the academy's changes, Oliver returned to training at a different location and discovered something important. He had never lacked ability. He had lacked encouragement. The letter ended with a simple sentence that Ellis kept on his desk. "Thank you for creating a place where people can become better instead of being reminded they aren't good enough." Ellis read those words often, because they represented exactly what the academy had always been meant to become. Meanwhile, Evelyn Harper continued growing into a person she never imagined she could be. The woman who once avoided attention now stood confidently in front of groups of teenagers, sharing lessons about resilience. She never presented herself as someone who had overcome everything. She was honest about difficult days, moments of doubt, and memories that still occasionally returned. That honesty made people trust her. She didn't teach others to pretend pain didn't exist. She taught them that pain did not have to control their future. One bright afternoon, Evelyn visited a local high school where students were preparing for graduation. The school counselor had invited her to speak about confidence and handling difficult transitions. As she looked at the nervous faces in the auditorium, she remembered herself years earlier. A young woman who believed she was too weak. A young woman who thought survival was the same thing as living. A young woman who never imagined she would one day help others find their courage. She told the students that confidence was not something people were simply born with. It was something built through small choices. Choosing to try again. Choosing to ask for help. Choosing to believe that one painful chapter did not define the entire story. After the presentation, several students stayed behind to speak with her. One teenager admitted she had been afraid to leave home for college because she didn't believe she could handle being alone. Another shared that he avoided activities because he feared embarrassment. Evelyn listened to each person carefully. She never rushed their feelings. She never compared their struggles to anyone else's. She simply reminded them that courage often begins with one small step. Across town, Brock Mercer was learning a similar lesson. His transformation was slower and far more difficult. Some people expected a dramatic moment where everyone suddenly forgave him. That never happened. Real life was more complicated. Some former students still avoided him. Some parents remained uncomfortable seeing him around the academy. Some people believed his past actions would always define him. Brock accepted that. At first, it hurt. He wanted people to recognize his efforts. He wanted someone to tell him he was forgiven. But over time, he understood something important. Doing the right thing only to receive approval was just another form of selfishness. True change meant continuing even when nobody noticed. So he continued. Every week he volunteered at the community center. Every month he helped organize events for young athletes. Every day he practiced patience. A few years earlier, he would have considered those activities beneath him. Now they were the most meaningful parts of his life. One spring morning, Brock was helping children during a beginner martial arts class at Iron Crest Academy. The room was filled with laughter as kids practiced balance exercises and simple movements. No one competed. No one tried to prove they were better. A small boy struggled repeatedly with a basic technique. Frustration appeared on his face. Years earlier, Brock might have criticized him. He might have told him to work harder. Instead, Brock knelt beside him and patiently demonstrated the movement again. The boy tried. Failed. Tried again. Finally, he succeeded. The excitement on the child's face was unforgettable. "Did you see? I did it." Brock smiled. "I saw." The boy looked proud. For a moment, Brock saw himself as a child again. The difference was that this time, the child in front of him received encouragement instead of pressure. And Brock realized he was helping change the story for someone else. That was the kind of victory he had spent his entire life searching for. Later that afternoon, Graham Holloway visited the academy. Although years had passed since the exhibition, people still respected him deeply. Not because he had been a Navy SEAL. Not because he had stepped into a difficult moment. They respected him because he never stopped showing up. He helped when nobody was watching. He listened when others wanted attention. He guided people without making them feel dependent on him. Graham walked through the training hall and watched the students practicing together. Evelyn was teaching a group of beginners. Brock was helping another class. Ellis was speaking with parents. The three people whose lives had been changed by that difficult day were now helping change others. Graham smiled quietly. He knew some moments in life arrive like storms. They tear apart what people thought they understood. But storms can also clear the air. They can reveal what was weak. They can expose what needs rebuilding. And sometimes, after everything falls apart, something stronger grows in its place. Near the end of the afternoon, Graham sat outside the academy beneath the warm sunlight. Evelyn joined him after finishing her class. "You ever think about that day?" she asked. Graham looked toward the building. "Sometimes." "Do you wish it never happened?" He considered the question carefully. "I wish nobody had been hurt." He paused. "But I don't wish away what people learned afterward." Evelyn nodded. She understood. The pain was real. The fear was real. The consequences were real. But so was the growth. Inside the academy, young students continued practicing. Their voices carried through the open doors. They weren't afraid. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They were learning. And that was the greatest change of all. The place that once celebrated power above everything else had discovered a truth that would remain for generations. A person's greatest achievement is not how many people know their name. It is how many people become stronger because they were part of their life. Years after that unforgettable exhibition, visitors still asked about the story behind the academy's transformation. Some expected to hear about a famous fighter. Some expected to hear about a heroic rescue. But the people of Ashford always told the same answer. They said it was the story of a woman who found her courage, a man who learned humility, a mentor who showed compassion, and a community that discovered the difference between strength and power. And every time that story was shared, it carried the same message. Nobody is defined only by their worst moment. But everyone is responsible for what they choose to do after it. Because the strongest people are not those who never fall. They are the ones who rise, change, and use what they learn to lift someone else. And that was the lesson Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy would carry forever. Years after the day that changed Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy forever, the story had become something people shared with new students before they ever stepped onto the mats. Not as a warning meant to create fear, but as a reminder of the responsibility that came with strength. Every new student heard about the importance of respect. Every instructor understood that teaching was not simply about techniques. Every parent who walked through the doors felt the difference immediately. The academy had become a place where people arrived carrying doubts and left carrying confidence. But even though the community had healed, the people at the center of the story continued facing their own personal challenges. Growth did not end when the crisis ended. It continued through every choice made afterward. For Evelyn Harper, one of the biggest challenges was learning to accept that she was no longer the person who needed saving. For months after the exhibition, she had secretly believed Graham was the hero of the story. After all, he was the one who stepped forward when others hesitated. He was the one whose calm presence changed the situation. But over time, Graham helped her understand something important. He had not given her strength. He had only helped her see the strength she already possessed. That realization changed everything. Evelyn began taking on more responsibilities at the academy. She started teaching beginner classes, especially for people who were nervous about joining for the first time. She remembered exactly what it felt like to walk into a room full of confident athletes and wonder whether she belonged. So she made sure nobody else felt that way. Before every beginner class, she greeted each person individually. She learned their names. She celebrated small improvements. She reminded them that progress was not measured by how quickly someone mastered a skill, but by how willing they were to keep trying. One afternoon, a woman named Claire Whitmore walked into the academy and stood near the entrance for nearly 10 minutes without moving. Evelyn noticed immediately. She recognized the uncertainty in Claire's expression because she had once worn the same look herself. Instead of asking why she was hesitant, Evelyn simply welcomed her. Claire admitted she had always wanted to learn self-defense but felt embarrassed because she was older than most beginners. Evelyn smiled. The first step is always the hardest one. Those words were simple. But they changed Claire's life. Months later, Claire became one of the most dedicated students in the program. Stories like hers became common. People who once believed they were too old, too weak, too inexperienced. They discovered they were capable of far more than they imagined. Meanwhile, Brock Mercer continued walking a difficult but meaningful path. He no longer trained to prove he was the strongest person in the room. He trained because discipline had finally become something peaceful. One morning, a former tournament competitor visited the academy and recognized him immediately. The man had watched Brock dominate competitions years earlier. He remembered the confidence, the arrogance, and the reputation. At first, he seemed surprised to see Brock cleaning equipment and helping younger students. "You used to be the person everyone wanted to beat," the man said. Brock looked up and smiled slightly. "I spent a long time thinking that was important." The visitor looked around the academy. "And now?" Brock watched a group of children laughing while practicing together. "Now I think helping someone else succeed matters more." The answer surprised the man. Because it came without pride. Without the need to be admired. Only peace. That afternoon, Brock received a letter from a young athlete he had mentored. The teenager explained that before meeting Brock, he had almost quit martial arts because he felt he would never be good enough. But Brock had taught him patience and reminded him that improvement was not about comparing yourself to others. The letter ended with a sentence that Brock saved forever. "You taught me that being strong doesn't mean nobody can hurt you. It means you don't hurt others because you were hurt." Brock read those words several times. They represented the person he had spent years trying to become. At the same time, Graham Holloway began reducing his public appearances. He was getting older, and although his mind remained sharp, his body reminded him that time moved forward for everyone. The community often worried that without Graham, things would return to the way they were before. But Graham never shared that fear. He believed the greatest teachers eventually become unnecessary. Not because they are forgotten. Because they successfully pass their lessons to others. One afternoon, while sitting outside the academy with Evelyn, he watched students teaching each other. "Do you see it?" he asked. Evelyn followed his gaze. "See what?" "The moment when people stop needing someone to guide them." She smiled. "You mean when they become leaders?" Graham nodded. "Exactly." Evelyn looked thoughtful. "I used to think leaders were the strongest people." Graham smiled. "Many people think that. What are they really?" He looked toward the students. "The ones who make others believe they can become strong too." That lesson remained with Evelyn long after their conversation ended. A few weeks later, Ashford hosted a large community celebration honoring local volunteers. The event took place in a beautiful public garden filled with families, music, and afternoon sunlight. Organizations from across the city gathered to recognize people who had made positive changes in their neighborhoods. Iron Crest Academy received an award for community service. When Coach Ellis was invited to accept it, he surprised everyone by inviting Evelyn, Brock, and Graham to stand beside him. The crowd applauded. But Ellis raised a hand. This award does not belong to one person. He looked at the audience. It belongs to everyone who chose to make things better. The words reflected everything the Academy had learned. No single person had transformed the community. Change happened because many people decided their actions mattered. After the ceremony, a young reporter approached the group and asked Graham what he believed was the biggest lesson from everything that happened. Many expected him to mention courage, or discipline, or leadership. Instead, Graham answered with something much simpler. People are more than their mistakes. The reporter waited for more. Graham continued. But they are also more than their achievements. He looked around at the families gathered nearby. What truly defines someone is what they choose when nobody is forcing them. The reporter wrote those words carefully. Because they captured the heart of the entire journey. Not revenge. Not victory. Not punishment. Growth. As the afternoon continued, Evelyn watched children running through the garden. Some wore martial arts uniforms. Others carried books from the library. Many recognized her and waved excitedly. She smiled. A few years earlier, she would never have imagined standing in a place like this. She had believed her past had made her smaller. Instead, it had given her a deeper understanding of others. Her scars had become reminders of survival. Her fear had become empathy. Her pain had become purpose. And perhaps that was the greatest transformation of all. The day slowly moved toward evening, but the community remained gathered beneath the warm sky. Conversations continued. Families laughed. Volunteers shared stories. Nobody talked about the exhibition anymore. Not because it was forgotten. Because it had become something greater. A lesson. A turning point. A reminder that even painful moments can lead people towards something better. The story of Iron Crest Academy was never truly about a black belt, a Navy SEAL, or one terrible mistake. It was about every person who faced the choice between staying the same and becoming better. It was about the courage to admit wrong. The patience to rebuild trust. The compassion to forgive. And the strength to help others rise. Because sometimes the person who needs the most saving is not the one who has been hurt. Sometimes it is the person who has forgotten how to care. And sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating an opponent. It is discovering the person you were always meant to become. The years that followed brought many changes to Ashford, but the message born inside Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy remained stronger than ever. New generations of students entered through the same doors, unaware of the fear and conflict that had once surrounded the building. They only knew it as a place where people encouraged one another, where mistakes were treated as opportunities to grow, and where strength was measured by kindness as much as skill. For those who remembered the past, the transformation felt almost unbelievable. The same halls that had once been filled with silence and hesitation were now filled with laughter. Students who once trained alone now supported each other. Instructors who once focused only on competition now focused on character. Parents no longer worried about whether their children were becoming stronger physically while becoming weaker emotionally. The academy had finally become what it always claimed to be. A place where people became better together. Coach Raymond Ellis eventually stepped away from daily leadership and passed responsibility to a new generation of instructors. It was not an easy decision. The academy had been his entire life. But he understood something that many leaders struggled to accept. A good leader does not create followers. A good leader creates people who can continue the mission without them. On his final official day as director, Ellis walked through the academy one last time before classes began. He touched the old wooden desk in his office where he had spent countless hours making decisions, some good and some he wished he could change. He looked out the window at the students arriving in the bright morning sunlight. A young instructor was helping a nervous child tie a belt. A teenager was encouraging a beginner who had made a mistake. A parent was thanking a coach for being patient. These were the moments Ellis had once overlooked while chasing championships. Now they were the moments that mattered most. He smiled quietly. The academy was finally in good hands. Evelyn Harper continued building her own legacy in ways she never expected. Her work at the library expanded, and she created a community program that combined reading, confidence building, and personal development for young people. She called it the Brighter Steps program. The idea was simple. Every person had a story. Every person deserved the chance to write a better chapter. Children who struggled academically found encouragement. Teenagers dealing with insecurity discovered confidence. Adults rebuilding their lives found support. Evelyn never forgot where she came from. Whenever someone told her they felt weak, she understood. Whenever someone said they had lost themselves, she listened. She knew that sometimes people did not need someone to fix them. They needed someone to remind them they were still worth fighting for. One afternoon, during a Brighter Steps event, a young girl named Hannah Miller stayed behind after everyone else had left. She quietly approached Evelyn and admitted that she wanted to join the martial arts program but was afraid she would fail. Evelyn smiled. She recognized that fear instantly. "Do you know what I learned?" Evelyn asked. Hannah shook her head. "Failure isn't the opposite of success." The girl looked curious. "It isn't?" "No. Failure is usually the place where success begins." Hannah thought about those words. Then she signed up for her first class. Years later, she would remember that conversation as the moment she stopped being afraid to try. Brock Mercer also continued changing in ways nobody expected. His journey was never perfect. There were still days when old habits tried to return. There were moments when criticism hurt. There were moments when he wondered whether people would ever truly see the person he was becoming instead of only remembering the person he had been. But he learned not to run from those feelings. He learned to accept them. One afternoon, he visited the academy and found a group of advanced students practicing. One of them was a young man named Caleb Foster, a talented athlete who reminded Brock of himself years earlier. Caleb was fast, powerful, and naturally gifted. But he was impatient. He became frustrated whenever others struggled to keep up. Brock recognized that attitude immediately because he had lived with it for years. Instead of criticizing Caleb, he sat beside him after training. He shared stories about mistakes he had made. He explained that talent could open doors, but character determined whether people wanted to stay in the room with you. Caleb listened quietly. At first, he struggled to accept the advice. But over time, he changed. He began helping younger students. He became more patient. He discovered that being respected felt far better than being feared. And Brock realized something that gave him a peace he had never experienced before. He was no longer repeating the cycle that had hurt him. He was ending it. Graham Holloway watched all of this with quiet satisfaction. He spent less time speaking at events and more time enjoying simple moments. He walked through parks, visited old friends, and continued mentoring whenever someone needed guidance. People still introduced him as a former Navy SEAL. But Graham never introduced himself that way. To him, that was only one chapter of his life. The most meaningful chapters came afterward. One sunny afternoon, Evelyn visited Graham at his small garden behind his home. The flowers were beginning to bloom, and birds moved between the trees while the warm breeze carried the scent of fresh grass. They sat together, reflecting on how much had changed. "I used to think that day was the worst thing that ever happened to me," Evelyn admitted. Graham looked at her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think it was the day I discovered who I really was." Graham nodded. That's the strange thing about difficult moments. He looked toward the garden. They don't always reveal how strong we are. He paused. Sometimes they reveal how strong we can become. Evelyn looked down thoughtfully. I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been there. Graham smiled gently. Someone else would have stepped forward. She looked surprised. You believe that? I do. He continued. People often think heroes are rare. He glanced toward the neighborhood. But every community is full of people capable of doing the right thing. Sometimes they just need to remember they have that choice. Those words stayed with Evelyn. Because she understood something now. The greatest change from that difficult day was not that Graham had saved her. It was that his courage had inspired everyone else to find their own. Years later, when people told the story of Iron Crest Academy, they often focused on the dramatic moment when everything changed. But those who truly understood the story knew the real transformation happened afterward. It happened in every apology. Every second chance. Every small act of kindness. Every person who decided to become better. Because life rarely gives people perfect beginnings. Sometimes people are shaped by painful experiences. Sometimes they carry regrets. Sometimes they lose their way. But every person still has the ability to choose what comes next. And that choice can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before you go, leave a comment telling us what lesson from this story meant the most to you. Was it Evelyn finding her courage, Brock learning humility, Graham showing compassion, or the community discovering that change is possible? Because sometimes the people who inspire us most are not the ones who never fall. They are the ones who fall, face the truth, rise again, and use their journey to help someone else stand. And that was the greatest lesson Ashford ever learned. True strength is not found in the power to control others. True strength is found in the courage to become better, the humility to admit when we are wrong, and the compassion to help others become better too. Continuing the story with the same emotional tone and flow. Time moved forward, but the lesson created inside Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy continued traveling far beyond the walls of the building. Years after the exhibition that changed everything, people who had never even visited Ashford knew about the Academy's transformation. They heard about it through students, families, and community members who carried the message wherever they went. But the people closest to the story understood something important. The transformation was never about one single moment. It was about every decision made after that moment. It was about the courage to admit mistakes. The patience to rebuild trust. The humility to change. And the willingness to believe that even people who had caused harm could choose a different path. On a warm spring morning, the Academy welcomed a new group of young students. Their nervous faces reminded the instructors of every beginner who had ever walked through those doors wondering whether they belonged. One boy stood near the entrance holding his training uniform tightly. His name was Mason Whitaker, and he had spent most of his life avoiding anything competitive because he feared embarrassment. His parents had encouraged him to try martial arts because they believed he needed confidence. But Mason wasn't convinced. He watched the experienced students moving across the mats and quietly wondered if he would ever be good enough. Evelyn noticed him immediately. She approached him with the same kindness she had once needed herself. She didn't tell him he would become a champion. She didn't promise everything would be easy. Instead, she told him something much more valuable. She told him that everyone in the room had once been a beginner. Everyone had once struggled. Everyone had once doubted themselves. Mason listened carefully. Then he stepped onto the mat. It was a small decision. But sometimes the smallest decisions create the biggest changes. Years earlier, Evelyn had been the person standing at the edge of the room wondering if she belonged. Now she was the person helping someone else take the first step. And that was how the cycle of courage continued. Across town, Brock Mercer continued his work with young athletes. His reputation had changed completely. People no longer introduced him by mentioning his championship record. Instead, they talked about the lives he had influenced. Some people still remembered the old Brock. He accepted that. He understood that becoming a better person did not require everyone to forget the past. It required him to prove, through consistent actions, that he had learned from it. One afternoon, a former competitor approached him after a community event. The man had known Brock during his most arrogant years. "I never thought I would see this version of you," he admitted. Brock looked toward the children playing nearby. "Neither did I." The man smiled slightly. "What changed?" Brock thought for a moment. Then he answered honestly. "I realized I spent my whole life trying to prove I was strong because I was afraid people would discover I wasn't." The former competitor listened quietly. "And now?" Brock watched a young student helping another child practice a movement. "Now I know strength was never something I needed to prove." That answer represented years of growth. Not a sudden transformation. Not a perfect redemption story. A real one. A difficult one. A human one. Meanwhile, Graham Holloway's influence continued spreading even as he stepped further away from the spotlight. People often asked him to tell stories from his military career. They wanted dramatic moments. They wanted stories of danger and impossible situations. But Graham always redirected the conversation. He preferred talking about ordinary courage. The teacher who stayed late to help a struggling student. The neighbor who checked on someone living alone. The parent who admitted they needed help. The teenager who chose kindness instead of following the crowd. To Graham, those moments represented the true measure of character. One afternoon, a group of students from Iron Crest visited him at a community event. They wanted to thank him for everything he had done. One student asked him what the hardest thing he had ever faced was. Everyone expected him to mention a dangerous mission. Instead, Graham looked thoughtful. "The hardest thing most people face is accepting that they can become better than they were yesterday." The students listened carefully. "Changing the world sounds impossible," he continued. "But changing yourself is where everything begins." Those words became something the students carried with them. Years later, many of them would repeat that lesson to others. The message continued. The kindness continued. The change continued. One afternoon, the Academy held a special gathering to celebrate 20 years of service to the Ashford community. Hundreds of people attended. Former students returned with their families. Instructors shared memories. Parents spoke about how the Academy had changed their children's lives. Near the center of the event stood three people whose journeys had become connected forever. Evelyn, Brock, and Graham. They looked around at the crowd and saw the results of everything that had happened. Not perfection. Progress. A young woman who once doubted herself now inspired others. A man who once used strength to intimidate others now used it to protect and encourage. A mentor who stepped forward during a difficult moment now watched an entire community carry his lessons forward. During the ceremony, Evelyn was invited to speak. She stood before the crowd beneath the bright afternoon sky. Years earlier, public speaking would have terrified her. Now she stood confidently. She looked at the faces in front of her and smiled. She explained that many people believe heroes are created during extraordinary moments. But she had learned something different. Heroes were created through everyday choices. The choice to listen. The choice to forgive. The choice to apologize. The choice to help. She reminded everyone that kindness was not weakness. Compassion was not surrender. And forgiveness was not forgetting. Forgiveness was the decision to stop carrying anger that prevented healing. The crowd listened silently. Because everyone had experienced moments when they needed another chance. When the ceremony ended, families stayed behind talking and sharing memories. Children practiced techniques on the grass. Adults laughed together. The atmosphere felt completely different from the fear-filled room years earlier. The same community that once watched someone misuse power had learned how to use power responsibly. And that was the greatest victory. Not a trophy. Not a title. Not a championship. A changed community. As the sun moved lower across the sky, Graham stood beside Evelyn and watched the celebration continue. "You know," he said quietly, "there was a time when everyone thought that day would be remembered because of what went wrong." Evelyn looked at him. "And now?" Graham smiled. "Now it's remembered because of what people chose to do afterward." Evelyn looked across the field. She saw Brock helping children. She saw students encouraging one another. She saw families smiling. And she understood. A painful moment had not destroyed them. It had revealed them. It had shown who was willing to grow. Who was willing to change. Who was willing to stand up. Because life will always bring moments that test people. Moments that reveal weaknesses. Moments that challenge beliefs. But those moments do not have to define the ending. The ending is created by what happens next. And in Ashford, what happened next was extraordinary. People chose compassion. People chose accountability. People chose hope. And because they did, a place once remembered for fear became a place remembered for courage. A place where everyone learned the same unforgettable lesson. The strongest person in the room is not always the one who can win the fight. Sometimes it is the person who has the power to hurt someone, and chooses kindness instead. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before you leave, tell us in the comments, what do you think is the greatest form of strength, winning against others, forgiving someone, or becoming a better version of yourself? Because every person has a story. Every person has a chance to change. And sometimes, the person who needs a second chance the most is the person who can become the greatest source of hope for someone else. I'll continue and bring the story to a complete emotional ending in the same style, finishing the remaining arc with closure, redemption, and the final message. Years continued passing over Ashford, and with every passing year, the story of Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy became less about the painful moment that started the change and more about the countless moments that followed. People who visited the academy for the first time often expected to hear about championships, famous fighters, or impressive achievements. Instead, they heard stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They heard about students who stayed after class to help beginners. They heard about instructors who learned to listen before they taught. They heard about volunteers who gave their time without expecting recognition. They heard about a woman who discovered her courage after a moment that almost broke her. They heard about a man who spent years chasing respect before finally understanding that respect could never be forced. And they heard about a former Navy SEAL who proved that the greatest heroes were often the ones who never asked to be called heroes. The story survived because it carried a message everyone needed. People can change. Communities can heal. And one person's decision to do the right thing can inspire hundreds of others to do the same. One summer afternoon, the Academy held a celebration unlike any it had hosted before. It was not a tournament. There were no rankings. No winners. No losers. It was a day dedicated entirely to gratitude. Families filled the outdoor training area. Children practiced movements they had learned. Parents shared stories about how the academy had helped their sons and daughters become more confident. Former students returned from different cities just to visit the place that had changed their lives. Evelyn stood near the edge of the gathering, watching everything unfold. She smiled as she saw a young girl teaching another beginner how to properly tie a belt. That simple moment reminded her of the past. She remembered standing alone years earlier, wondering if she belonged. She remembered feeling invisible. She remembered believing someone else's cruelty had the power to define her. But life had shown her something different. Pain could become purpose. Fear could become courage. And broken moments could become turning points. Brock approached her quietly. The years had changed him. The arrogance that once surrounded him was gone. His posture was calmer. His voice was softer. But the biggest difference was not something people could see. It was the peace he carried. "I never imagined this place would become what it is now," he said. Evelyn looked around. "Neither did I." Brock smiled. "Do you ever think about how different everything would be if that day never happened?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought carefully before answering. "I think about it sometimes." She looked toward the students laughing together. "But I don't think we should wish away every painful moment." Brock nodded. "Why?" "Because some moments hurt us." She paused. "But some moments teach us." Brock looked down. "I spent a long time wishing I could erase who I was." Evelyn looked at him. "And now?" He watched a group of young students practicing teamwork. "Now I understand that I can't erase the past." He smiled slightly. "But I can make sure it doesn't control the future." Evelyn nodded. That was the difference between regret and growth. Regret only looked backward. Growth looked forward. Later that afternoon, Graham Holloway arrived at the celebration. Although he was older now, his presence still carried the same calm strength everyone remembered. Students immediately gathered around him, eager to hear stories and advice. But Graham did not stand above them. He sat with them. He listened. He laughed. He asked questions. Because he had always believed that every person had something valuable to teach. A young student approached him holding a small notebook. Inside were handwritten lessons the child had collected from different mentors at the academy. The student asked Graham if he had one final lesson to add. Graham smiled. He thought for a moment. Then he wrote, "Always remember that the person standing beside you may be fighting a battle you cannot see. Choose kindness whenever you can." The student read the words carefully. Years later, that notebook would still exist. And those words would still matter. As the celebration continued, Coach Raymond Ellis stepped onto the small stage. Age had slowed him slightly, but his voice remained strong. He looked at the crowd. Then he looked toward the academy building. "When we built this place, we thought we were creating athletes." He smiled. "We were wrong." The crowd became quiet. "We were creating people." Those words received the loudest applause of the day. Because everyone understood. The Academy's greatest achievements were never the medals hanging on the walls. They were the lives changed inside those walls. The children who found confidence. The adults who found healing. The instructors who learned humility. The community that learned courage. As the afternoon came to an end, Evelyn, Brock, and Graham stood together outside the academy. 3 people connected by one difficult moment. 3 people changed by the choices that followed. Evelyn looked at Graham. "Do you think people ever really finish changing?" Graham smiled. "No." She looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because becoming better isn't something you finish." He looked toward the setting sun. "It's something you choose every day." Those words stayed with her. Because they were true. Brock would continue choosing patience. Evelyn would continue choosing courage. The academy would continue choosing compassion. And the community would continue choosing hope. Many years later, when people asked Evelyn about the day that changed her life, she never described herself as a victim. She never focused only on what happened to her. Instead, she talked about what she learned. She talked about the people who stepped forward. She talked about the people who admitted mistakes. She talked about the power of second chances. Because she understood something important. A person can experience something painful without allowing that pain to become their identity. A person can be hurt without becoming hateful. A person can lose confidence and still find courage again. And that was the lesson she wanted everyone to remember. Not every battle is won by defeating someone else. Some battles are won by refusing to lose yourself. The story of Iron Crest Martial Arts Academy remained alive because it reminded people that humanity was not measured by perfection. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has moments they wish they could change. But what matters most is what comes after. Do we accept responsibility? Do we learn? Do we grow? Do we choose kindness when anger would be easier? Those choices shape who we become. And in Ashford, one difficult day led to a lifetime of better choices. A woman who once doubted herself became a source of strength for others. A man who once demanded respect learned how to earn it. A community that once stayed silent learned the courage to speak. And a retired Navy SEAL proved that true heroes do not create fear. They create hope. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Before you leave, tell us in the comments, what lesson from this story will you carry with you? Is it the importance of forgiveness, the power of changing yourself, or the courage to stand up when something is wrong? Because every person has a choice. Every person has a story. And every person has the ability to become something greater than who they were yesterday. Sometimes the greatest transformation begins with the hardest moment. Sometimes the deepest wounds create the strongest compassion. And sometimes the person everyone thinks is defeated becomes the person who teaches the world what true strength really means.